Hi, I'm Floyd Teeter, the Emergency Preparedness Coordinator for the South Jordan North Shore Stake of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you're a return visitor, welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome, but you may want to check out some of our prior videos so that this one makes more sense. In this episode, I want to talk about communications during an emergency. Now, as you may recall, we're somewhat likely to experience some communications disruptions during an emergency here. While the probability is somewhat lower on the scale, the ability to communicate during an emergency is still critical. I'll give you some recent examples, but I want to preface this by saying that my intent here is not to create fear, but to give you some feel for the importance of communications during an emergency. We'll start with Hurricane Ian. It happened relatively recently in Florida. And this is a statement from the Collier County Sheriff's Department one day after landfall. For those worried about family and loved ones, we have limited power, virtually no cell service, and no internet. This is especially the case in the coastal areas where the surge came in. Portable towers are on the way for cell service. Chances are your loved ones do not have the ability to contact you. What a heartbreaking statement to come out of the sheriff's office the day after landfall there. In this second example, we go to the California wildfires that we've all been hearing about over the last few years. In the face of worsening climate change, California is investing billions of dollars in high-tech solutions to predict and respond to natural disasters. Meanwhile, communities throughout the state facing fires, floods, and winter storms are increasingly embracing the century-old technology of two-way radios as a fail-safe. In rural areas where disasters can easily knock out power and cell coverage, these networks are becoming an essential piece of the communications ecosystem. That's from an article in Cap Radio on using radio networks for emergency communications. And I've given you the link if you want to know more. And this last one comes from our recent history with Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans a few years back. On Monday, August 29th, the call for help involving a combination of cell telephone calls and amateur radio led to the rescue of 15 people stranded by floodwaters on the roof of a house in New Orleans. Unable to get through an overloaded 911 system, one of those stranded called a relative in Baton Rouge. That person called another relative who called the local American Red Cross. Using that Red Cross chapter's amateur radio station, Ben Joplin, WB5VST, that's his ham radio call sign, was able to relay a request for help on the Saturn network via Russ Fillinger, WZLXR in Oregon, and Rick Kane, W7KB in Utah, back to Louisiana, where emergency personnel were alerted. They rescued the 15 people and got them to a shelter. And I've given you the link to the CBS News article if you want to know more. Now, when we talk about communications during an emergency, we may not have to deal with hurricanes, but certainly earthquakes and wildfires are on the menu. And you'll want to consider two sets of objectives, and we'll go through both of them. The first, the church's emergency communications objectives, and then your own personal communications objectives. There's a lot of overlap between the two, but it's important that you consider both. So we'll go through them. And the first one is the church's communications objectives. They're laid out pretty clearly. At the bottom of the slide, I've given you the link so that you can see the source information from the church's manual that contains all this information. Now, the objectives of the church in an emergency are ensure that critical information can be received and conveyed, including the transfer of information instructions from the top down, from area, mission, and stake leaders to ward leaders, missionaries, and members. Reports on the status of missionaries, church members, and properties that would be flowing from the bottom up. Plans for responding to needs among church members in the community, and then coordination of relief efforts with civil authorities and other relief agencies. You've got a block diagram here that tells the story pretty well. So that's what the church will be focused on. As far as your own personal emergency communication objectives, they'll be slightly different, a little bit of overflow, but slightly different. You'll want to be able to communicate with and possibly gather together local family members. You'll want to communicate with widespread family members, those who are not in the area of the emergency, but who are worried about you. And then, of course, you'll want to be in the midst of that communication flow of receiving and responding to information from church leaders, civil authorities, and relief agencies. So then we get down to the meat of the matter. How are you going to do it? What methods are you going to use to communicate during an emergency? Well, here's a list of some alternatives for you. Let's go through them quickly. Cell phone. I love my cell phone. It is in my pocket all the time. You'll rarely find me without it. The benefits of a cell phone are they're used widely. Some considerations that cell service requires cell coverage and towers. While they're highly mobile, you're also going to want a means of charging that cell phone in the event of a power outage. When you can't plug the wall wart into the wall to charge the cell phone, how are you going to do it? So the technology is a little tenuous and it's fragile in a major disaster, as we saw in the examples I gave you today. Common use cases, both one-on-one communications. I can pick up my cell phone and call somebody else. And then large-scale broadcasting. We've seen some of that with things like Amber Alerts here. Then there's your landline phone that's hardwired into your house. Those of us who still have landline phones, and there aren't very many of us, and I say yes, us, but I don't have one anymore, but they may still work in a power outage. When I had a landline phone and I went through power outages in Southern California, my landline phone still worked. The problems with landline phones is it's tied to a physical location. It's not mobile. If you have to leave your home, impending wildfire, earthquake destruction, whatever, you cannot take your landline phone with you. And even if you can stay, if the wires that connect phone servers to your house are damaged, won't work. And then, of course, there's one-on-one communication. That's what you use a landline for. You can't do broadcasting over a landline phone. Then there's SMS and text messaging, and I think of my cell phone first with that, but I also think of my laptop. And the nice thing about SMS and text messaging is that even when I can't make a call because the system is overwhelmed, very often a text message or an SMS message will get through. So that's something to consider. The communications are for small messages at best. If whatever device you're using, you'll want to be able to recharge it in the event of a power outage. They're great for field communications. Not quite as reliant on as cell phone voice calls on your tower and your service. So something to consider there, that text messaging is a little more resilient. Then there's the internet, email, social media, web conferencing, Skype, WhatsApp, TikTok, Zoom, whatever. It's certainly versatile and it's certainly resilient. We have seen lots of instances where there's been emergencies or political unrest around the globe, and Twitter has been a way for folks to communicate. Challenge is it requires an internet connection and an enabled device. So it's only going to be as resilient as the internet infrastructure. So if your power goes out, your cell service goes out, highly likely that your internet service will go too. So there's that issue. And then of course, whatever device you're using, you'll need to recharge it if the power goes. What I like about it is it's often used for mass coordination of relief efforts. So if you can keep that going, by all means do so. Satellite phones. Sat phones are pretty cool. They work when cell service, the internet are down. The drawbacks are they are really expensive. And in terms of expense, not just the hardware, but subscribing to the service, it is the gift that just keeps on giving in terms of massive bills. It works well in areas where the signal is good and the system's not overloaded. And you can use it for incoming and outgoing calls. It's pretty reliable stuff. Then there's amateur ham radio, which is resilient even in the worst of circumstances. You will find ham operators going, and they'll be working communications during an emergency. The challenge with ham radio is number one, it requires a license, and that license requires passing an exam. It is not a trivial thing. I know I've gone through it. I'm still going through some of it. I'm a ham radio operator, and the testing's not trivial, nor is the cost of gear. The cost of your gear increases as your desired range of communication goes up. In other words, when you start talking about, I want to communicate 5 miles to maybe 40 miles, that's one price bracket. Then you talk about 500 miles, that's another price bracket. Then you talk about around the globe, that's another price bracket. You get into gear prices that end in 3 zeros really quickly. And the other thing is there's fading participation. As the internet has come on, this amateur radio stuff, which is really World War I, World War II tech. So it's older tech. It's not as popular. And so you've got fewer and fewer ham radio operators every year. It's very common for voice communications and digital communications into and out of disaster areas. Yes, you can text with amateur radio. And then there's the family radio service, FRS radios. Walkie-talkies is the most common form of that. They are too resilient, even in the worst circumstances. The downside is FRS radios have a very limited range. We're talking about in daybreak, I would say 2 miles is a really great performance for an FRS radio. The upside is there's no license required, and the gear is really inexpensive. If you know folks that are into four-wheeling or ATVing in the mountains, many of them will communicate between vehicles with FRS radios. Use cases, reliable means for family members and local organizations to communicate during disasters. The thing to keep in mind here as you look at these methods is there's no single right answer for everybody. And the methods are not mutually exclusive. In fact, I would suggest to you that you want to have at least two, because in an emergency, one is none and two is one. What that means is if something fails, you've got something to fall back on. I'll give you an example of my case. Cell phone and text messaging, tops of my list. My fallback, amateur radio, ham radio, and FRS radio. That's how in our family we'll communicate during an emergency. Your choices can be different, and that's fine. Just pick something and make sure you have some means of mind to communicate during an emergency and that you've worked it out with your family. So let me give you some insight as to how we're preparing as a state. Number one is I'm engaged with the Church Sandy Bishop Storehouse Emergency Communications Network. That's a ham radio net, which means that we meet on a regular basis on an assigned frequency. In this case, we meet weekly, and the network is composed of stake emergency coordinators and stake emergency communication specialists throughout, oh, I'll say throughout the Salt Lake Valley area. And we have all worked out our gear, how it works, making sure that we can talk to each other. We have a method of communication from the storehouse down to each of the emergency coordinators and back up to the storehouse. And so we meet every week and talk about those things and make sure that our gear is in working shape. It's like a 30-minute meeting on Tuesday nights. The other thing we're doing is we're forming a stake family radio service net. Now, we tried this with ham radio operators, but what we found was that there are not enough active ham radio operators within the stake boundaries here to form a net. So we're going to try it with family radio service radios via, in other words, walkie-talkies. Any stake member is welcome. Please feel free to join in. The net purpose here is to establish a communications network to be used in an emergency when telephone service isn't available, to allow those preparing for emergency communications to test their equipment, and to establish the stake net as an arm of the Sandy Bishop Storehouse Emergency Communications Network. So it's an easy way to get into that flow of church information from the top down and from the bottom back up. If you're interested in something like that, you can email me at fmteeter@gmail.com. I put my email link in here so that you can email me if you want to get into something like that. If you want to join us, that would be great. Now, I can feel as I record this the bubbling enthusiasm for FRS radios and joining the stake net. So let's talk for a minute about those FRS radios so I can give you a little bit of guidance here. Number one, as I mentioned before, there's no license required. The gear is relatively inexpensive. Look down a couple of bullets and you'll see that current prices start at about $15 a unit and go up. And that is after being impacted for inflation. There are several reliable producers. I've listed them here. That's not all the reliable producers. They're just the ones that I know and that I can look at and say, yeah, they build a good radio. Be sure you buy a multi-channel product. And the reason I say that is because there are some FRS radios that only allow for one channel. And we don't know what frequency we'll need to use in the event of an emergency or even where we'll start that out. So buy a multi-channel radio model so that you can switch back and forth between FRS frequencies. And again, I'll point out the limited range. You'll hear all sorts of claims from manufacturers about extended range, 40 miles, 50 miles on an FRS radio. Unless you're standing on the top of Mount Timpanogos and broadcasting down into the Salt Lake Valley, you're not going to get that kind of range. Again, it's going to be a mile to 2 miles from daybreak. I will say that is spectacular range for a walkie-talkie. And that's what we're talking about here. So disregard all those claims. That's manufacturer buzz. Okay. So if you if you need some help in picking out gear, if you decide to go this route, feel free to email me at fmteeter@gmail.com. Email on the prior slide. I'll be happy to walk you through it. So that pretty well wraps up what I have on emergency communications. I hope you all will take this to heart and give your emergency communications plan some serious consideration. So until next time, be safe, be smart, and be ready.